So, hello everyone. My name is Peter Battisti, and I'm the executive director of an international nonprofit, Future of Fish. Over the past 20 plus years, I've worked at the intersection of industry and investment as an entrepreneur, developer, and then as an advisor to startups and investors in several industries, including renewables, real estate, and food systems. I joined Future Fish in 2013 at a time when the organization was recognized as at the cutting edge of applying systemic approaches to solving complex problems. This aligned well with my passion to create pathways for capital and resources to flow in support of sustainable, equitable development. In order to get a feel for what Future Fish's role is and how we do our work, which Possibility Ocean is aptly described as an innovation integrator, I'll be sharing a case study of a project related to electronic monitoring being led by our office in Chile. So first, who is Future of Fish? Future of Fish is an international nonprofit whose purpose is to support the transformation of at-risk coastal communities into thriving centers of sustainability. We do this through applying innovative, systemic approaches to tackle investment, supply chain, and technology challenges. To do this work, we partner deeply with local organizations who share our approach and have an intimate understanding of their stakeholders in the local context. These localized relationships are essential to ensure we are gaining trust and traction on the ground. However, the need to scale and create viable long-term change relies on integration with top-down initiatives. Thus, an essential part of our work is to bridge bottom-up efforts with top-down initiatives or mandates. And finally, in regards to our approach and speaking to the role of the innovation integrator, we have spent considerable time developing and testing an approach that we utilize called the fishery development model, which is a framework to evaluate and understand a fishery system, identify gaps, and co-design with stakeholders a portfolio of interventions that we can implement in a staged process for incremental improvements to support thriving sustainable fisheries. I won't necessarily refer back to the framework in the presentation, but you'll see its application in all of the work that we'll share with you in this presentation and the subsequent panel discussion. So to set some context for the EM program in Chile, in 2012, the Chilean government passed a law that required SUPESCA and CERNAPESCA, the agencies responsible for the oversight of policy and fisheries management, to establish an electronic monitoring regime in order to diagnose, reduce, and control discards and incidental bycatch. The law included a requirement that all boats incorporate vessel monitoring systems, also known as VMS, to monitor all fishing activity in order to detect and punish any illegal activities. The rollout of the program has been staged to first cover the industrial fleet numbering over 100 vessels, which started in 2020, and currently is extended to the large artisanal fleet as of 2024, which includes over 500 vessels. Given the scale of the fleet size in Chile, this EM program is incredibly ambitious and presented a number of high-level challenges to CERNAPESCA, the government agency. One of the earliest challenges was coordinating across government agencies to design a data framework in order to meet the remit of various stakeholders, including the Navy, responsible for ports and safety, and IFOP, which conducts scientific assessments, among others. Failing to plan ahead could prove costly if the framework needed to be redesigned. Additionally, the burdens placed on CERNAPESCA far outweighed their resources and existing capabilities, including limited budget, staff time, and a lack of experience in managing such large, complex data systems. And finally, though the industrial sector is generally compliant in adopting VMS in the first phase of the regime, the large artisanal fleet has already indicated resistance to the mandate, including concerns about affordability, privacy, and lack of incentives, among others. Given that the range of challenges that CERNAPESCA was facing were not just technical in nature, but also included disrupting existing social and business structures, which was outside of CERNAPESCA's remit, CERNAPESCA sought Future of Fish's partnership, given the trust that we had built with fishery communities in supporting supply chain improvement projects. We gladly welcome the opportunity to fill this innovation integrator role, as the EM mandate complemented our mission to support the transition to more sustainable fishing practices. Our partnership with CERNAPESCA kicked off in 2021, and our initial engagement was to support the design of a comprehensive EM data framework. This started with a trip to the US with CERNAPESCA to conduct field visits and see the EM system in action on the US West Coast. Additionally, Future Fish led a co-design among Chilean government agencies to support the initial design phase of the data framework. And last, we recruited a new partner, the Environmental Defense Fund, EDF, with vast experience supporting other countries' EM programs to advise on technical matters for the evolving needs of the Chilean EM regime. The inclusion of EDF as a technical expert was strategic for us to fill in knowledge gaps in order to continue to support Cernapesca. And in 2024, Future Fish secured multi-year funding for our collaboration to work more strategically developing a long-term vision and tactical plan to advance EM over the next 3 to 5 years. So it's important to note here is that we filled the role of innovation integrator, and how we were doing that was by attracting funding for our collaborative work and also bringing in outside expertise. So one of the primary issues our collaboration is tackling now are the technical challenges related to data management. In partnership with EDF, we will support Cernapesca to evaluate technologies, conduct cost assessments for EM infrastructure and maintenance, investigate AI solutions to streamline processes, among other technical strategies in order to develop and refine a robust EM system. Additionally, Future Fish is engaging with the artisanal sector to understand and develop strategies to address resistance to VMS adoption. That will include conducting pilots with VMS tech providers to install and test the technologies with an initial group of willing vessel owners, using it as a learning opportunity to refine the rollout to the broader fleet. And finally, as we progress these two implementation strategies, we will develop tactical plans to support scaling of the EM program. This has many aspects, but examples include exploring financing mechanisms for fishers to adopt technology and qualifying appropriate vendors, hardware, and software technologies that can be compliant with the EM regime. Several pilots will be conducted to support the rollout strategy, as well as inform any policy changes for the EM regime to be better streamlined. So here in the role of innovation integrator, we take on additional responsibilities, which are designing and implementing collaborative pilots and sharing that knowledge in the context of the broader EM regime remit to test, refine, and continue to progress advancing the changes that we seek. So what does this case study start to tell us about the role of innovation integrators? First, the role requires us to be empathetic and deeply understand the individual needs and challenges of stakeholders, which helps us to co-design collaborative solutions to create win-win situations that can create shifts in the system. Second, we recommend recruiting a small cohort of key stakeholders to initiate pilot projects, which allows us to test strategies, collect data, and then adapt and pivot to replicate and scale. This reduces the risks of over-designing solutions that aren't practical, or you later find out aren't contributing to the shifts that you're hoping for. And last, there is a need to match top-down approaches or mandates with bottom-up initiatives. Mandates can provide our North Star, but how we get there in complex systems with so many stakeholders requires engagement on the ground. The value of someone filling the innovation integrator role is that they are working for both sides to succeed. So in the next panel, we'll reflect and expand on the role of innovation integrator to also discuss situations where there are no mandates forcing change, and how we approach stakeholders with different incentives to drive collaboration and innovation in support of sustainable business practices. Joining me to lead that discussion will be my colleague, Larry Taylor from the Yield Lab. I can kick off the discussion. Larry and I kind of discussed a flow here, some of the questions that we would go back and forth with. So the initial item that we were discussing are kind of what are the differences between having a mandate, and when mandates aren't in place, what other strategies can you utilize in order to engage with stakeholders and supporting transition to sustainable production? With mandates, they can come in many different forms. The EM program in Chile is a perfect example of that. As you can see in other types of mandates include catch documentation requirements for exports, imports, quota systems, as well as fish refuges and MPAs. So there's a number of ways to kind of create top-down mandates that require compliance. Typically, a lot of these mandates don't necessarily cover all fish that's being produced in a single location, as multiple species are usually available to producers. And so one of the major challenges is that we see, especially with mandates, is that they don't necessarily provide positive incentives for fishers. And so when you have more of the stick than the carrot, it can be very difficult for fishers to make adaptations and comply with those. And there's often resistance to them. Um, so mandates are very useful. They're very effective. They create action, but they aren't always comprehensive in many fisheries. They don't cover all species sometimes, or deal with the difficulties of the production of wild capture seafood. And in that case, we typically look at market-based approaches. How do we provide positive incentives we work with primarily small producers to support better business practices that increase profitability and resilience. Larry and I have collaborated on opportunities together. Larry through his, what was that?
Hey, Peter.
Larry, uh, keep
I've
going
got an
or?
I've got an update for you. We're still working on Larry's audio, but if you'd like, I'm going to sort of ad hoc continue to interview you because
Oh,
I know that we have
perfect.
talked extensively about the work that you're doing.
Sure, that sounds great.
And I do want to apologize to everybody for the audio difficulties. As we'll just say, technology is what technology is, and we make the most of it. So, yes, Peter, if you would continue, I know that one of the things you were really excited to talk about, and I'm sorry that I can't bring Larry's expertise to this conversation, is the coordination and the big vision that the two of you shared. And I wondered if you'd like to talk about that big vision, and I've got some follow-up questions I can ask you as well.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we'll spitball here. So,
Yeah.
so Larry and I have collaborated for quite some time. You know, one of the challenges that we both recognized was, especially we've engaged with the shrimp industry in Southeast Asia with a number of different partners trying to support more sustainable and better production techniques. And so we've been partnered with local NGOs and also some industry bodies to understand what are the types of programs that we can design and deliver. And one of the potential uses, as we talked about on the last panel, is what's the applicability of digital services technology. And so we have, well, we definitely see challenges in terms of connectivity in many places, digital literacy. Certainly in some locations, you're starting to see access to, fintech and online banking. You're starting to see services being delivered. You're seeing many of these entrepreneurs, new blue tech entrepreneurs getting out there. And what Larry has seen from his perspective as a venture capital firm is that a number of investments are being made, but the challenge of getting these tools, especially in the small scale industry, is substantial. So, providing a value proposition to a small scale producer who already is going to be challenged, needs to see a direct benefit of what that technology can provide them. And that comes down to usually generating more income or reducing costs. How do we make those technologies available? And what's particularly challenging is, trying to create the super app is first incredibly difficult, and then it overwhelms those small producers. So how do we start to get traction in adopting these digital tools is some of the things that we worked on, and I could talk more about like what our approach has been to think about that. Um,
Yeah, well, that's my follow-up question to you is, we're talking about sort of this global movement, but you've had a lot of success working at a regional level, and I'm really interested in what takeaways you can share with our entire audience about sort of what scale seems right for this kind of work. And
yeah,
maybe you're biased, but I know that we've talked about the regional nature of the kind of work you've done.
yeah. Incredibly challenging to pick the right scale of a system that you're evaluating. because often, we work in some fisheries where there's multiple species. And so we have fishery improvement projects that are launched, including certain co-ops or nonprofits, and they're focused on one species of several that those fishers catch. So it's difficult because what we're trying to do is truly change the business model of fishers to transition. And so those mechanisms don't necessarily jive with the definition of the system that is the businesses themselves. And so what we typically look at is certainly a geographic limitation, because a lot of what we need to do is how do we design the delivery mechanisms, so that producers can get access to resources. And often that is, especially with finance, it makes sense to do that in, within a specific country, rather than trying to go outside that. Within existing supply chains, you also have incredibly different, when we look at, scallop production in Peru versus, which is mariculture, versus wild capture and the mahi fishery, which is one of the largest in the world. You'd look at them and you'd say semi-industrial vessels. You've got, different scale at different types of fisheries. So you've got to be able to understand what's the business model of those that you're trying to engage, and what are the appropriate types of solution, because all financing solutions are different depending upon how much production, what's the volumes, is there a credit history, are those fishers formalized? So it becomes incredibly difficult because it's hard to aggregate them. You can see that in certain industries like shrimp. Um, but if you can't aggregate, then you also have problems of how do you design mechanisms that can attract outside financing, that really meet the needs of some of the partners that you need to bring on board to deliver those services. So it's a huge challenge of how do you design, how do you understand what the limitations of that system are in order to develop solutions.
So, we've got 60 seconds here, and I know that Larry really wanted to be on. And so I'm looking forward to circling up with the both of you to talk more about how we can, what information we can share about the collaboration that you've put together. Is there anything that you think we need to know, or anything that we should be discussing in our Slack chat, um, kind of building on the point you just made, that will advance this overall or big picture conversation about where these innovation integrators fit together? And you've got
Yeah,
1 minute on the clock.
1 minute on the clock. Yeah, I think, it's when we talk about the data challenges we have in fisheries, it requires a number of different stakeholders to come to the table. And, a lot of what we're relying on is governments, to be kind of the saviors here, provide the policies, create, enforcement. The budgets to do that are just, they're immense. And if we're not looking at how we partner the business side with what is, yes, the compliance side, and I think really use the business side to drive data collection. What are those models, that we can provide incentives to get people more into the formal economy, adopting technology, and then how are we collecting that data and how's that data being shared? And that's really complex. That requires, from our perspective, that requires somebody trying to understand all the different parties, and how do we set this up without it just being like, hey, we're going to go or provide digital services, access to markets, and it's an afterthought, or it's not even a consideration of how do we share this data so it's useful to others. And so we are always thinking about how are we designing solutions where we're putting in these safeguards, we're collecting data, we can share that data as much as possible, and we're moving towards a formalized economy where that is part of the transparency. Obviously, there's data, there's privacy concerns that are there, but as an innovation integrator, our job is always to think about other people. That's it. We're trying to empathize and create win-win solutions with them. That's our job, and as well as being strategic of how we help to move those players forward, and doing it, hopefully leaning as much on positive incentives and market-based solutions as mandates are required as well. So that bottom-up approach to really understanding what's happening on the ground and creating viable solutions, we see so many times funds come in, and they can't invest. And a lot of that is, let's get on the ground and figure out what those products are that are needed, from the bottom up, and then we can design those top down solutions that really can start to shift the needle.